Welcome to another episode of Orenda Books at Bedtime. I'm Karen Sullivan, publisher of Orenda Books, and tonight we're taking you to South Africa for a treat. We're going to be visiting Michael Stanley. For those of you who don't know, Michael Stanley is in fact two authors, Michael Sears and Stan Trollope, and they write together as Michael Stanley, best known for the Detective Kubu series. Now, we've published 3 books in this series, outstanding series, and I would highly recommend you start with them. But for now, we're going to be talking about their very first standalone novel, which is called Dead of Night. We'll be reading from the part of the book that takes place at night, where everyone is wearing night vision glasses. Stan and Michael are going to be telling you more about this book in a few minutes, but let me just give you a little taster. When freelance journalist Crystal heads to South Africa, she thinks she'll be researching an article on rhino smuggling for National Geographic, while searching for her missing colleague. But within a week, she's been hunting poachers, hunted by their bosses and then arrested in connection with a murder. And everyone is after a briefcase full of money that may hold the key to everything. Fleeing South Africa, she goes undercover in Vietnam, trying to discover the truth before she's exposed by the local mafia. Discovering the plot behind the money is only half the battle. Now she must convince the South African authorities to take action before it's too late. She has a shocking story to tell, if she survives long enough to tell it. This is fast-paced, relevant, chilling. Some of the quotes that we've had in for Michael Stanley. Yrsa Sigurðardóttir, for instance, says, "As dark as the darkest of Nordic noir." Peter James says, "A wonderful, original voice." The Library Journal says that it's impossible to put down. Jen Med's book reviews, "I was intrigued from the first page." And now, handing you over to Michael Stanley in South Africa.
Hello, I'm Stan Trollope, half of the writing team known as Michael Stanley. We've written 6 books in a police procedural series set in Botswana in southern Africa, with the main character, Detective David Kubu Bengu. And we've recently launched a new book through Orenda called Dead of Night. It's a thriller set in southern Africa and Vietnam with a backstory of the horrendous rhino trade, rhino poaching, rhino horn smuggling. Our new protagonist is a Vietnamese woman, Crystal Nguyen, who is a refugee in Minnesota in the United States from Vietnam. In a few minutes, Michael's going to read a short excerpt from our new book called Dead of Night. But in the meantime, I want to just say a few words about how 2 of us can write together. We're often asked that, how do you do it? And we often respond by saying, that's not the correct question. The real question is, how can anybody write alone? It must be an amazingly lonely existence. At least we have somebody to talk to, somebody to laugh with, somebody to brainstorm with, somebody to give us a kick in the pants if we're slacking, somebody to blame if things aren't going too well. And in general, it's a wonderful companionship. And we've been doing it now for 16 years and are still close friends. The way it works, very briefly, is that once we've decided on the broad landscape of a new book, in this case, the rhino poaching, and we know who the main protagonist is, Crystal Nguyen, we start writing different parts of the book at the same time. We are what is called pantsers. That is, we write by the seat of our pants. We don't outline the book. We are interested in seeing where the book goes, just as a reader is interested in seeing where it goes. And sometimes we land up near the end, still not knowing who the bad guy is or the bad woman is, or how it's going to end. Once we have that broad brush view of what the book's about, I will start writing a chapter or part of a chapter, and Michael will do the same. We talk a lot via Skype or WhatsApp, so we know where each is at the moment. And when a particular section is finished, we swap it over. I send my piece to Michael, he sends his to me, and I edit it. I go through it from a story point of view, from a language point of view, from an idea point of view, and edit it and make all sorts of comments. new ideas may pop up. There may be parts that I really don't like, and when that's all done, I send it back to him. But of course, he's doing the same thing, and when I open my piece that I had sent to him with high hopes that he'd like it, very often it comes back covered in red ink. And this is a very productive process, even though it can be extremely painful sometimes, because you have an immediate feedback from somebody who has a very vested interest in the book. Each piece can go backwards and forwards 15 times, sometimes 20 times. And our friends say, oh, they know who wrote each chapter. And we laugh because they're only right half of the time. There's no doubt that writing together takes longer than if you write by yourself. And there's no doubt that the end book is different from one that I would write or that Michael would write. And so we say that somewhere in the ether, maybe over the Atlantic Ocean, because I'm often in Minneapolis and Michael's often in South Africa, that over the ocean there is somebody called Michael Stanley, an author Michael Stanley, who is different from both of us. We hope you enjoy the book, and here's Michael to read an excerpt.
Hello, I'm the Michael half of Michael Stanley, and it's a pleasure to be on Books at Bedtime this evening. I'm going to read a piece from our new thriller, Dead of Night, published of course by Orenda Books. And I'm going to read the piece where Chris, who's a National Geographic reporter investigating the rhino poaching and rhino horn smuggling from South Africa to China and Vietnam, is writing her National Geographic article. She's very keen to go out with an anti-poaching team to see how it actually is really at the front, so to speak. And she finds that she gets much more than she bargained for. The next hour crept by, and Chris was having a hard time keeping still. Usually she was always on the go, so an hour without moving was not easy. What made it worse was that she didn't know what was going on. She couldn't see Bongani, who was hiding behind a tree about 20 meters away, and she didn't know what any of the others were doing. They were all out of sight. The whole time she was terrified that a poacher was creeping up on her and that she could be killed at any moment. She was sure anyone nearby would hear her heart because it was pounding so loudly. Suddenly a white figure moved out from behind the tree Bongani had chosen. Chris held her breath and took aim with her rifle, praying it was him and not someone else. The figure came towards her. Was it Bongani or a poacher? She couldn't tell. Chris, the figure whispered. Chris let out her breath. It was Bongani. He leaned over and whispered, Henny has seen two people moving towards the rhino. He wants us to move around behind them to cut off their retreat. She nodded and gritted her teeth. Bongani moved off to the left at a faster pace than they'd used before. Chris struggled to follow his footsteps while keeping an eye out for low branches and glancing back in case someone was coming up from behind. They'd walked for another 15 minutes or so when Bongani stopped and motioned Chris to come up level with him. Henny says the poachers are within range. They're going to shoot them. Without warning, Chris whispered. Is that legal? She knew that some of the stuff she'd done in Minnesota wasn't legal either, but none of it involved killing anyone. When two shots rang out, the boom of a big caliber rifle and the crack from a smaller weapon. Chris thought that the bigger was probably Henny's Remington elephant gun. Then came a fusillade of shots, then another two from the big caliber, then silence. Bongani put a finger to his earpiece for a moment and listened. Then he whispered, Henny thinks there were 4 in total. 2 are down. The others are headed this way. You go behind that mapani bush over there. He pointed to the left. I'll find another one. Remember, if you see anyone coming this way, shoot. Don't wait for them to shoot first. What if it's Henny? Chris whispered nervously. It won't be. They've something else to do. Before she could ask him what, he'd disappeared. She crawled behind the thick mapani bush and lay down, her heart beating wildly. She wondered what Henny's group could be doing. Maybe the rhino had been shot and needed attention. After about 10 minutes, a shot rang out. Chris nearly jumped out of her skin. It seemed to have come from right next to her. She looked around but saw nothing. Then another shot, equally close. Then silence. And more silence. The blood was pounding in her ears. She didn't know if Bongani had done the shooting or had been shot. She turned her head slowly to look behind her. Nothing. Nobody. She breathed deeply and soundlessly repeated her mantra to get her heart under control. Eventually it slowed down a bit. Suddenly a white image appeared from behind a tree to the right. Chris swung her rifle towards it and sighted. "Chris, don't shoot! It's me, Bongani!" It had to be Bongani. A poacher wouldn't know her name. But she kept the rifle aimed at the oncoming figure just in case. Finally she lowered it. "Let's check that the two I shot are dead," he said. "Then we must go to where Henny is." Chris stood up and walked out from behind the bush. She was shaking. Ahead she saw two white figures lying motionless. "Keep your rifle ready," Bongani said. "If the left one moves, shoot him. I'll watch the one on the right." They moved slowly towards the two bodies, dodging from one tree to the next. There was no movement. Eventually they were behind trees only a few meters away. Chris stopped, unable to believe what she'd got herself into. "Watch the left one carefully, Chris," murmured Bongani. She aimed at the man, not completely sure what she would do if he did move. Then Bongani ran from behind the tree and kicked her rifle away from the other man's grasp. He kicked the man in the stomach. There was no reaction. He repeated the same thing with the man Chris was covering. Same result. Both were either dead or so severely wounded that they couldn't react. Chris held her breath as Bongani felt each man's pulse. "Dead," he said, looking in her direction. He picked up the rifles and took all the bullets he could find. "Let's go." "Are you just going to leave them here?" Chris asked, shocked. Bongani nodded. "When the hyenas are finished, nobody will even know they were here." He walked on. For a moment, Chris couldn't move. He turned to see where she was. "It's better this way, believe me."
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week for another episode of Orenda Books at Bedtime.